Hello and welcome. Can you guys hear me? Great. Okay. We're here to talk about plugins today. Widgets and action filters and tasks and event handling. Oh my. So we're going to walk through some sample plugins. But first I will introduce myself. I'm Dennis Rosen. I'm known as New York in the forums. I'm nopCommerce MVP and the Chief Software Architect at noptools.com, where we have Shipping Director and Payment Director. So first a quick survey to see whether the audience has developed plugins before. Has anyone developed plugins for nopCommerce before? Can you show here? Okay. Anyone others who haven't developed nopCommerce but are familiar with C# and MVC? Okay. And then it looks like some people didn't put their hand up for either, so you're neither a developer nor a nop developer nor a C# developer. That's fine. Okay, so we are going to kind of look at an overview of plugins, really. We'll kind of dive in a little bit on two particular plugins. A simple plugin that uses an action filter, which kind of showed you how you can override the shipping amount. I think there's a typo in there. That should be a widget, actually. And then another one, Become a Vendor plugin, which demonstrates a few additional features like widgets, action filters, and scheduled tasks, all in a single plugin. And then if there's some time left over, we can have a little Q&A as well. So initially, for those who haven't or kind of new to developing plugins, first disclaimer is that I'm going to be showing you 3.8, 3.9 type plugins, not 4.0 plugins. So for those of you who have not done much development at all, read the documentation. Clearly, it's a good place to start. And look at the sample plugins. I mean, generally, depending on the kind of plugins that you're building, you can take one of the sample plugins and you can pretty much modify it to suit your needs. We'll talk a little bit about the types of plugins and when that's a good thing to do. When you are developing your own plugins, you want to take advantages of the framework. John earlier, I don't know if you saw John's discussion, he talked about the different, he kind of went over an overview of the framework of nopCommerce. And there's a lot of capability in that framework, and services are there, and you should use them. You know, even simple services. Whoops. There. Simple services or complex services. Anything that you need to do in terms of getting information out of the database, you can probably go to the service. If you can't, you can always go to the repository if you need to, and I'll show an example of that. Oh, how did that get there? Yeah, one minor. We had a little technical problem. I do not have the proper plug to. I have a micro HDMI here, and it would not plug into their equipment. So we're doing a screen share. So there might be a slight lag but it looked like it wasn't too bad. Okay. So if you can't use services, use the repositories. There are the database access can be directly accessed, but to do that well, you need to understand some link. So if you don't know link now, it's something you should probably learn because it's it's a powerful. Okay. And the other thing when you're getting started is to just copy paste existing code. I mean, if you're building a plugin and you need to use a service and you have an idea of what service you need to use, but you don't know how to really use the service, is to go in and look at the existing code. You know, go look at the core code and see, okay, well, how do I insert a vendor? Well, I'll go to the administration functionality in the nopCommerce core code, and I'll find out how the administration page inserts a vendor. And then I'll just copy some of that code, and we'll see some examples of that. And kind of the last point here is just the logger. There's the ability, also there's a logger that's kind of built into the nopCommerce framework, and it's good to log information so that someone is using your plugin and there are problems, and then he knows he can just go to system log and figure out what's going on. Okay, I mentioned before the resources, developer documentation, sample plugins. There's out-of-the-box plugins. You can go right into nopCommerce source code and look at the out-of-the-box plugins. And you can go to the marketplace. I mean, there are a lot of free plugins out there, or some plugins that may not be free but might have source code. If they do what you need, then you certainly want to consider them. The forums is a great resource. If you have questions, go to the forums and ask the nopCommerce blogs and third-party blogs. So there's a lot of information out there. Clearly, if you're stumped, just ask a question on the forum, and I'm sure that someone will help you out. Okay. So kind of an overview of plugins. So John earlier talked about the framework kind of in general. His time was cut a little short at the end. He actually didn't talk too much about plugins, so I will pick up where he left off. So plugins is about extensibility, about the ability to do additional features that are just not in the box, or potentially to modify what's there because it doesn't suit your need. So there's always that question about, do you create a plugin or do you modify core code to do what you want? And there's no easy answer, except in general you should try to do it as a plugin. But sometimes there are difficult things to do in a plugin that you might just have to modify the code. You know, the caveat when you modify core code is that you void the warranty. No, just kidding. It's open source. The caveat with modifying core code is that when you upgrade the next version, you're going to have to go and make the same kind of changes again. All that custom code that you put into the core code, you're going to have to go and make those same changes in the new version. You might be able to diff the code and see what the differences are and be able to make those changes easily. But if they've made some architectural changes in the core code that might break your custom changes, then it's kind of back to square one in terms of trying to figure it out. If you isolate it into a plugin, then you do the upgrade. You'll probably have to recompile your plugin. You may have to make some changes. There might be additional changes. They may have changed the interface. But in general, you can usually get away with just recompiling. You might have to modify your dependencies. Sometimes you have to go back to NuGet or pull some additional dependencies. And then the next question on plugins is, if you have a lot of functionality that you need to create, do you create lots of different plugins, one that's isolated to the type of functionality, or do you create this one massive all-in-one plugin? And that's something you need to weigh also. Sometimes you have several functionality features that you want to add to the system, and maybe, like I'll show you in particular example where the become a vendor does a few things. It has a scheduled task, it has a widget, so it just made sense in that case to create a single plugin that had all that functionality. But it's a decision as to whether you want to break things up into modular pieces. So the out-of-the-box plugins, discount rules, exchange rate. So here I just kind of have a little directory here of the plugins that are built into the system. And there's the core ones like discounts or shipping providers and payment providers. If you have to create your own shipping provider, if you don't like the fixed rate or the by weight plugin and you want to create your own custom shipping provider, then that's a great place to start, is to copy the functionality. Just copy an existing plugin and make changes. And the other types of plugins, widgets, for example, and we'll talk a little bit more about widgets. If you need to create some functionality, if you want some display, some new functionality on the front end, and you don't want to modify the core code, then you can introduce your widget plugin. So I do have just a general idea again on the I don't have any pointer here, do I? In this list here, you've got the plugins that are out of the box, and the typical ones: discount rules, payments, shipping, and tax and widgets. These are just some custom ones that we've created in the past, depending on what you want to do. Payments, net terms, very much like a COD. Segment.com is like a Google Analytics, um, the ability to do Fishbowl. I don't know if you heard of Fishbowl as an ERP system, so you can do synchronization, import, export type integration. It's a simple integration with an ERP type system. So there's the types of functionality that you can create is somewhat, unlimited. Whatever functionality that you need that you don't think is in your system, you can build it as a plugin. Okay. The general idea in nopCommerce, you're dealing with base plugin, you're still working in an MVC model. So you might be only working at a service layer and it may not matter to you, but if you're building a kind of user interface, if there is some user interface, even the configuration screen, the administration configuration, then you need to understand a little bit about the MVC. Interfaces is the way that you kind of implement a particular type of plugin. So if you want to create a shipping plugin, then you need to implement the interface that the shipping plugins are required to implement. Same with payment plugins and so on. And we'll get into some code here. Dependency injection, constructor injection. John talked a little bit about that earlier. That's the way that you can add those services that you need, all the other functionality that's in nopCommerce, and you want to be able to add. You need to use that functionality. You'll inject it into your code. Plugins typically have settings, so you'll create your own settings, and you'll be able to use the services to be able to load those settings. So typically, you're coming into you're handling an action in your controller. You need to get some settings before you really do things. The first thing you'll do is load those settings. Language string resources. If you want to be you can certainly hard code things if you like to hard code your strings, but you'll see that nopCommerce is global. It's localized their strings, so therefore it's a good model to follow. If you do need to get to database access, or you need to provide database access, even simple shipping plugins like the fixed rate. It's called now fixed or by weight, but the by weight plugin. It has to store information about those different weight ranges. So you need to have database access to do that. So if your plugin requires to store information in the database, you'll be using the DB context for that. And generally, every plugin will have an install and an uninstall, so that you can. It gets called automatically when you're on the administrator plugin list, and you just click that install button. That's the routine that it will call. Okay.
I'd like to add something just real quick. Uninstall, especially if you're using DB context, and I think this is a great forum for this, that when you uninstall, don't leave fragments of information in the database if it doesn't need to be there, especially if you're upgrading. It'd be really nice as part of the uninstall process to have a selection or a path to upgrade to the next version of your plugin. So I've seen it in several plugins where you uninstall and it leaves a table out there, and then you go and fetch the next version of the plugin and install and upgrade, and the database, it can't handle it. It errors out, and so we have to manually go in and clean up the table or something like that. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's one thing I had actually mentioned probably quite a long time ago regarding an update. Besides install and uninstall, it would be nice if there was this built-in update capability, and we've actually put that into our plugins we store a setting in the database using settings, as we mentioned before, and when the plugin gets initiated, it looks at the setting and sees whether it matches the version number that's in the current one, and if it doesn't, then it tries to apply, patches, so to speak. It applies whatever additional localization might be required or additional settings that might be required, so it kind of runs part of the install process, even though it's not going through a full install. It's just something to keep in mind when you're building the plugin, especially if you're building a commercial plugin, probably more importantly than if you're doing something in-house. But that idea, it's a good point that when you uninstall, you probably want to delete all your settings. You probably want to delete your locale strings. And when you're just upgrading and you don't want to have to force the customer or the client to uninstall and then reinstall your plugin, then having some kind of an update capability is usually a good idea. Okay, so widgets, just copied a little bit description here from Wikipedia. It's kind of a standalone application embedded into a third-party site. It's a small application, but in nopCommerce, the idea is that you're embedding the widget plugin in certain areas to inject HTML. So the idea is to put some HTML or JavaScript or some functionality into your page. So clearly, as we mentioned before, you can go right in and open up the CSHTML file and just put it in there. But if you do that, then you're somewhat limited in terms of what you can do, and then the discussion about the capability for upgrading, the problems that you might run into when you do upgrades. So widgets, are there people here familiar with widgets in general? How many people understand what a widget really is? Okay, so we'll kind of show an example of that. But even if you're using the out-of-the-box Nevo slider, so if you install your nopCommerce right out of the box and you use the Nevo slider, that is a widget, appears on the home page and displays the images. So there are widget zones within that HTML file, and they typically will look like this here, the @HTML. Whoops, well, keep thinking I have a pointer and I don't. So the HTML widget, they're kind of scattered throughout several of the core pages in the CSHTML file. But there's nothing magical about those widget identifier strings. You can create your own. So in this case, widget checkout shipping rate override. So when I show you the demo of the shipping rate override, I just, there was a particular place that I wanted to place the HTML, and there wasn't already an existing widget zone there. So I create my own. Part of the instructions are when you install this particular plugin, you've got to open up the CSHTML file and put it in there. So, it's not ideal from the end user perspective, but it allows you to a finer level of positioning exactly where you want your widget to appear. So widgets effectively subscribe to zones. So when you're building your widget, you're really looking, you're going to be answering a call for that zone. And I briefly mentioned the interfaces before. So by just having, by implementing the iWidget plugin, you effectively, the widget system in nopCommerce knows that you're a widget. So all you really need to do is implement that interface, and now you become a widget. But you do need to support the interface. You need to handle it. Get widget zones. So here, the widget zone, you have to just indicate which zones you're going to be listening for. You need this public info action result. So that's where you'll actually be generating your, that's the controller action for that widget. And then, as I mentioned before, the widget zone itself, in this case, a custom one that I just put into a CSHTML file. Okay, so I'm just going to skip ahead just a little bit to show you some code. Oops, that's not what I want. Actually, you know what? I will start. I'm going to just show you the page. Okay, so I'm a shopper on the site, and I'm going to check out with an item in my cart. Okay, so what I've done here is the shipping methods, I've injected this text box in here through a widget. Unfortunately, in this version, the label is not showing up, and I didn't have time to figure out why. But I can go through the checkout process here, and rather than choosing one of these, I can still choose that I'm going to use ground or next day or so on, but I can override the amount. So this particular plugin, the idea here is that an administrator, whether impersonating a customer potentially, can change the amount of the shipping. So they might be on the phone with the customer and there's some special shipping requirement that they need, and they can override the shipping price of it. And let's see. Okay, so first thing I want to mention is when you create the action, when you're dealing with action filters, so we're kind of intercepting with that HTML, we're intercepting it, and we're going to be able to inject this. We're going to be able to grab that override amount. Actually, I guess, you know what, I'm going to back up a second here. Just go back to, let's start from the top. So the override shipping is going to implement that widget plugin. So now I become a widget. I'm going to implement the obligatory get widget zones and configuration route. Got my install, as we mentioned before, where I want to be able to set up any locale resources. And the same with the uninstall. So you can see it's the core part of this plugin is fairly simple in terms of implementing those few methods that are required in terms of implementing the interface. And then if we look at our controller, we have our configuration, which is the configuration page for the controller, which I will show you briefly. Let's go to widgets. So widgets show up on the widget page in addition to being on the plugin list. And I don't know if you can read all that, but so when we created this plugin, we just put some instructions in there. Many plugins don't have quite a verbose instructions, but in this case, the widget, we wanted to be sure that there was an understanding that you needed to place the new widget zone in the right place. And we just suggest whether you're using the one page or the multi-page checkout. Okay, and the idea is that you can allow an impersonator or an administrator to be able to override the shipping amount. So the configure page handles that. Okay, and there's an action for both the get and the post. And the public info page is really what is going to appear in the public store. So the configure action handles the administration side, and the public info handles the store, the public store. Okay. So as I mentioned before, you're generally going to have some settings. You're going to load your settings, and you're going to, in this case, we're checking. One of those settings was to figure out whether or not impersonators are allowed to do the overriding. So it kind of checks all that. And then ultimately finally returns the view if it doesn't, assuming you have the privilege. Otherwise, if you don't have the privileges, it won't return the view. Okay. So in this case, we're using an action filter to handle. So let me, I'm just going to go back to my PowerPoint again, talk a little bit about. So action filters, the idea is here that you're doing interception. You're kind of intercepting the normal chain of events that the MVC takes. And in this particular case, it's actually, this is from a different example, but this particular action filter is the customer registration action filter. And this, the on action executed. So there's kind of two parts to the action filter. One is the get filters. The first thing that actually gets wind up getting called by the pipeline, I guess MVC, is this get filters. And this is where you're going to determine whether or not this particular action filter applies to your situation. So here I'm checking to see that I'm in the shipping method page. So I'm looking at the controller. I want to see that I'm in checkout controller and that the action is the shipping method action. And if it is, then I will continue on. Otherwise, I'm going to return this empty set at the bottom. Additionally, I'm just checking those settings again to see whether or not I'm impersonating or an admin. So by returning this filter, it's kind of telling the system that, yes, we are intercepting this action. And then ultimately, we implement the code to, in our on action executing, to be able to process it. Okay. So here we intercept by using the request form variable. We've set up in our form, our public form had this override amount in it. So we're polling for it. We're basically saying, did we see this override amount? And if we did, or if we didn't, we should return. But otherwise, we're going to try and get the value there and stuff it into the shipping amount. Okay. Whoops. Just ignore some of these comments in here. Okay, so the shipping amount is ultimately stored at the customer level. So I'm not sure if you've ever noticed, but if you're a customer and you were to go through the checkout process in your cart, and then you just thought, oh, I have to do more shopping. I went through, I picked a shipping method, but I'm going to go back and do some more shopping and then come back again. And it won't necessarily require you to then pick that shipping option again, or it knows that you've picked that previous option. So all that information, when you're going in your session from one page to the next, a lot of that information is actually stored in the attributes. So in this case, we wind up stuffing the amount into, we're looking at that attribute, and we're going to, keep track of that information. Okay, just seeing how we're doing on time here. All right, I guess I'll take a quick break for questions here. Does anyone have any questions regarding action filters?
Are action filters actually available on all of the functionality or not?
So the idea with the action filter is the interception. So if there's a controller, effectively, you're intercepting a controller action with an action filter. So when you ask that question, it's like, well, I'm not going to build a service. If I need to, override the payment service or something, I'm not going to use an action filter for that. But if I need to intercept controller information going back and forth to the controller, then I'm going to use an action filter to do that.
So if I'm getting price, for example, and I want to alter that price before it's shown.
You may not want to use an action filter that. You might want to go and override the service, because if you're trying to determine what the price is and you want it to be not something that you're sort of just displaying on this one page where, let's say, the product page, but rather you want the system to know about that price no matter where it is, because later on that object is in the cart and the cart needs to do its calculation. So you really want to get kind of at a deeper level, at the service level for that. So this is more of if you're trying to, controllers are more about user interface. So when you're dealing with intercepting controller actions, then you're really looking more at kind of a higher level in that sense, and not down at the level of providing a service. Okay. Okay. Schedule tasks. So with scheduled tasks, you can schedule a task to run at certain times of the day, and I'm sure a lot of you probably have seen the scheduled task in the administrator. You might use it to handle your emails, or to delete guest users. So you can create a plugin that can handle scheduled tasks. And effectively, as we mentioned before, the idea is just that you have an interface. I guess I should go back to my real PowerPoint here. So once you implement the iTask interface, and which requires at least the execute, then you can create a plugin that can supply functionality that can be called through the task scheduler. So the idea with Become a Vendor plugin is that you have vendors in your system, and you want let's say you're kind of creating a marketplace type of e-commerce application, and you want to have customers sign in and right away indicate whether they want to become a vendor or not. So this can provide a checkout box on the registration page. But additionally, that to become a vendor, you want them to pay a subscription fee. So if you're Etsy, for example, you go to the Etsy marketplace, you want to, they want their cut. So they want you to subscribe, and you can provide a product that you sell on your site, which allows vendors to become or customers to become a vendor. So the idea here is that there's also a widget that shows up on the registration page, and then additionally, we're looking to see that the customer buys a particular product. In which case, when he does, we're able to activate his vendor role, allow him to become a vendor, and the scheduled task then kind of monitors to see whether or not his subscription is current, and if it's not, it'll terminate him. Okay, so as we mentioned before, it's all about implementing the interfaces. So I implement iTask, and I'm now able to provide that capability. I don't know, John mentioned before about constructor injection. I guess if you're familiar with nopTools framework in general, you know that constructor injection is the way that you're adding services into your plugin. So I guess I won't talk too much about that, but that's sort of you want to be able to add that into your class and then execute. So in this particular case, I'm using services, as I mentioned before. Use the existing services that are there because the functionality is already built in. You might as well use it. And a very useful service is the logger. So it's good to log information about what's going on. So ultimately, this execute is going to happen, and it's just going to call a private method, which is going to look, in this case, for a particular, to see that the vendor is still an active vendor. Checks some expiration dates. It looks at orders. So I do want to go back to my my injections here. So I mentioned before that there are a lot of services out there that you can use, and if it's there, you should use it. But sometimes you don't have quite the functionality that you want, and you really need to get to the data. So there's no reason why you can't do that because you have repositories out there. So you can inject these repositories and then you can query the data directly to do any more complicated things that the service might not allow. So in this case, I decided to use a couple of repositories. Not sure why I'm getting this hover hint here. So here's a query. Link is something you really need to understand if you're going to be using the repositories. There's two styles of it. I kind of like the method calling style rather than the other syntax. And I use customers here, and I use orders here, because I'm looking for particular orders that fall outside this expiration date. And then I also need to get to the vendors. So as I mentioned, if you don't have a service that provides that capability, then you can always use the repository. You can refer to the service code, look at the core code to see how they implemented it. How is it they're querying the underlying repository, and you can copy some of that code and use that. Okay. How am I on time here? This ends at 3, right? All right, let me just see if I can quickly talk about event handling, and maybe we'll have a few minutes for questions here. So the other technology that's provided by the framework is events and event handling. So the idea of raising an event or publishing, I keep doing that, is that within the nopCommerce system, they publish events. So in the normal process order paid, so this is a core functionality to process an order payment, the nopCommerce system is publishing an order paid event. And you can handle that event as a consumer. And you can consume that event, and then you're able to kind of effectively, again, that idea of interception, you're able to tap into the flow that's happening within the nopCommerce system. Okay. All right, so we did kind of briefly go over this. I'm not sure why that hover hint is there, but action filters. And let's see. So since we're running out of time, I'll kind of jump into the questions here and see. So anybody have any questions? I know that was a lot to pack into the 40 minutes, but hopefully if you have any questions or you want to talk to me afterwards if there's not enough time here, feel free. Anybody?
Is there any significant overhead introduced by increasing use of action filters? If you use more, does it add more load? Does it affect your load at all?
That's a good question. I mean, there's always going to be a little bit of overhead in terms of intercepting, whether you're using widgets or whether you're using action filters. So it's going to run your code. So you do need to be kind of careful about that. And I don't know if you noticed the first thing that you want to do in the get filters is to make sure that you're handling a relevant interception. So you want to check, okay, is this really the controller and the action that I want to intercept? Because if it's not, then you really want to get out right away. So if you look at the action filter here, that get filters, really the very first thing it's doing is saying, am I in the checkout controller and is my action shipping method? Because it's not, then I just want to get out. So you just kind of need to be careful about that. So in the same, you'll see here then, that's one other thing I should mention is that within action filters, you cannot do dependency injection. So you're forced to resolve. And I don't know if maybe you've seen these before. It's been chatted a little bit on the forums as well. But if you need to get a service and you can't inject it, then you need to resolve it. And you can actually resolve these type of services even in HTML within the Razor code. So if you're within your .cshtml file and the view, and you want to be able to access the service, you can actually do that. So the same thing, you resolve that service, and you'll see here I'm resolving services after I've made that check, not before. So in a sense, there might be, when you're using injection, constructor injection, there might be that overhead that AutoFact needs to find those dependencies. Well, here you kind of avoid that because I'm not having it pull any dependencies for me until I've decided that this is an action that I want to handle. I'm not sure about that. I do recall that being brought up on the forums, and I don't recall what the outcome was that of I don't know if I would think it's going to kick off another instance of it, and you need to be careful about that, whether it's writing out to the database, for example, a flag, an indicator that you can check to make sure that you're not currently running. Okay, so so if this happened even a lot. This is kind of a support question I get a lot from users in terms of if there's a new version, or even if I give them a new license key for shipping director, and they have to start up the application again. Generally, you're gonna have to reload list of plugins. That should get you by 99% of the time. That if you publish your new plugin, just by taking the DLL and so on, put that into the plugin folder, all you really need to go into Administrator and click the Reload List of Plugin buttons, and that will usually do it 99% of the time. Do note, though, that it will also restart the web. So if you have customers that are shopping at the time, it will kick them off temporarily. And that other 1% of the time when that doesn't work, usually restarting the website also won't work. That ASP.NET caches temporary files, and the general way of getting around it is to touch or open up your web.config or your global.asax file at the root level and just add a blank line to the end of it. That will force the ASP engine to JIT recompile, and then that clears out all the garbage temporary cached DLLs. That's different. That cache is the kind of the database cache of things like resources and settings. So when I'm talking about the cache, I'm talking about this ASP.NET cache where it caches DLLs in memory. The only way to really clear that out and is to touch your global.asax file. So I think I'm running over. If you want to come up, I think we have a break now, right? Is this a break time? So if you guys want to come up and chat with me, you're welcome. Thank you.